It began in the heavy heat of a Florida morning in 1941 when the new Martin B-26 Marauder sat on the tarmac of MacDill Field like a machine that did not quite belong to the world around it. The sun glared off its narrow wings and sleek fuselage, creating long spears of light across the concrete. To the young pilots who had just arrived from training schools across America, the aircraft looked fast, predatory, and strangely unforgiving. They had flown trainers and twin-engine aircraft before, but nothing with the attitude of the B-26. Rumors raced ahead of the machine. Men whispered that its wing loading was too high, that its landing speed was dangerous, that it punished every tiny mistake. They joked nervously that the airplane wanted to kill them. The jokes did not last long. During those first months of training, the Marauder earned its infamous nicknames because it demanded precision that few rookies understood. A pilot who let the airspeed bleed too low on final approach found the aircraft dropping without mercy. A crew that mistimed engine power or flaps could see the bomber veer off the runway or sink too quickly. Some aircraft crashed into Tampa Bay after overshooting the field. Others stalled short of the runway when pilots tried to coax the machine to behave like slower bombers they had known. Soon the phrase, "one a day in Tampa Bay," spread across MacDill like a shadow. It was not an insult. It was fear distilled into a sentence. In the squadron barracks, men whispered about the steep learning curve, about how the Marauder fell out of the sky if a pilot hesitated even for a heartbeat. Newspapers printed stories suggesting the aircraft was unsafe. Some commanders questioned whether the program should continue. Congress demanded explanations. Yet the aircraft itself was not the enemy. The design philosophy behind the B-26 was simple. It was meant to be fast, faster than any bomber in its class. To achieve that speed, the engineers at the Glenn L. Martin Company gave it short wings and powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, the same engines used in frontline fighters. The result was an airplane that flew like a fighter and demanded a fighter pilot mindset. But the men arriving at MacDill were not fighter pilots. Many had only recently learned to handle standard twin-engine trainers. They were not prepared for a bomber that punished complacency. Each sunrise at MacDill began with the same ritual. Ground crews rolled the B-26s from their revetments, their aluminum skins warming in the Florida sun. Instructors briefed wide-eyed trainees on takeoff speeds, minimum cower settings, warning signs of a stall, and the stubborn truth that the Marauder had to be flown with authority. A pilot had to dominate it, not negotiate with it. The instructors repeated the same mantra until their voices were hoarse. Keep the airspeed up. Do not drag it in. Do not let the nose drop. Respect the aircraft and it will reward you. But respect grew slowly, and losses came quickly. Training sorties ended with burning fuel on the runway or wreckage fished from shallow waters. The base chaplains worked long hours. Letters home carried softened stories of mishaps. And despite the tragedy, the aircraft stayed. The Army Air Forces insisted that the B-26 was essential for the coming air war in Europe and the Pacific. Too much had been invested to retreat now. Engineers from the Martin Company flew to Florida to study the accidents and interview surviving crews. What they discovered was not a design flaw, but a training mismatch. Pilots were attempting to fly the B-26 like earlier bombers, pulling back power too soon, allowing speed to decay, or flaring too aggressively on landing. The Marauder tolerated none of it. Under pressure from Washington, the Army Air Forces created a new training doctrine specific to the B-26. Pilots would master high-speed approaches, longer flare distances, and strict engine management. They would learn to trust the aircraft's speed rather than fear it. But in late 1941 and early 1942, these reforms were still months from full implementation. For now, the young men at MacDill lived with the weight of the Marauder's reputation. In the briefing rooms, instructors pinned accident photos to the wall, forcing their students to confront the reality of errors measured in fractions of a second. Outside, the roar of engines filled the air as aircraft rose sharply into the sky, their twin R2800s shuddering the ground. Every takeoff was a test of nerve. Every landing was a negotiation with gravity that held no forgiveness. Yet even in those grim early days, some pilots sensed something hidden beneath the aircraft's harsh exterior. When flown fast and clean, the Marauder responded with a smoothness and stability unmatched by any bomber they had known. In level flight, it felt solid, almost graceful. In the hands of a confident pilot, it became something remarkable, a machine that promised speed and precision beyond the capability of its rivals. The problem was not the aircraft. It was the learning curve. The story of the B-26's rise from Widowmaker to one of the safest bombers in Europe began here, in the furnace of MacDill Field, where fear collided with innovation and where young men learned that the most dangerous machines in war were often the ones that would save the most lives once they were truly understood.
The transformation of the B-26 did not begin with a single revelation or a sudden discovery. It began with a quiet decision made in offices filled with maps, charts, and accident reports, where commanders and engineers realized that the Marauder was not a bad aircraft at all. It was simply an aircraft that demanded a new kind of pilot. By early 1942, the Army Air Forces launched a complete overhaul of the B-26 training program. The shift was not subtle, it was a revolution. At MacDill Field, instructors rewrote entire manuals. The old habits of flying twin-engine bombers were discarded. In their place came a doctrine built around precision, discipline, and respect for speed. Pilots were now taught that the B-26 could not be coaxed through the air, it had to be commanded. The first change came with takeoff procedures. Crews practiced holding full power on the R-2800 engines while standing on the brakes, feeling the aircraft strain forward before release. The moment the brakes lifted, the B-26 surged down the runway like a predator finally unleashed. Pilots learned to track the exact airspeed needed to lift off safely, maintaining a shallow climb to preserve energy. Instructors drilled them relentlessly on the idea that hesitation could be fatal, but confidence guided by strict technique could turn the aircraft into a weapon of extraordinary reliability. Landings were next. The Marauder did not forgive a low-speed approach, so new minimums were established. No pilot was allowed to bring the aircraft below a firm threshold. Airspeed was king. A controlled descent replaced the instinctive flare used on older bombers. The B-26 wanted a long, steady runway to settle onto, not a short, dramatic touchdown. Each trainee repeated the sequence until it became pure reflex. They practiced high-speed patterns, extended downwinds, and precise throttle work. On the ground, mechanics reinforced this transformation. They trained with equal intensity, learning to keep the engines at their peak, adjusting hydraulic systems, checking landing gear tolerances, and inspecting flaps and control surfaces with a ritualistic seriousness. The aircraft was no longer just an assignment. It was a challenge, a responsibility shared by everyone who touched it. Instructors quickly discovered which recruits were ready for the B-26. The nervous ones struggled. Those who hesitated during throttle transitions or tried to baby the aircraft often found themselves fighting it. But the pilots who embraced its speed, who treated the Marauder like a high-performance machine rather than an oversized trainer, found that the aircraft responded with a loyalty that bordered on elegance. One flight commander began calling the B-26 a wolf in metal, a creature that respected strength and punished weakness. His metaphor spread across the base. Soon pilots referred to the Marauder as something alive, something that demanded respect but rewarded courage. Slowly, a culture formed around the aircraft, a culture built on preparation. Briefings grew longer, checklists expanded. Pilots studied airflow diagrams and learned how to interpret the subtle noises of the engines. They memorized emergency procedures until they could speak them in their sleep. What once looked like fear now became determination. And for the first time, accident numbers began to fall. At the same time, experienced pilots returning from combat evaluations offered new insights. They reported that once airborne and properly handled, the B-26 was astonishingly stable. Its narrow wings and high power allowed it to outrun enemy fighters at low altitudes. In tight formations, it held position with minimal correction. These reports boosted morale and validated the belief that the Marauder was not a flawed design, but an advanced one. The Army Air Forces responded by expanding B-26 training bases beyond MacDill. Myrtle Beach, Dodge City, and other airfields became hubs where doctrine was standardized and perfected. Instructors rotated between bases to ensure that every pilot received the same rigorous foundation. By mid-1943, the transformation was undeniable. Pilots no longer entered the cockpit with dread. They entered with a quiet confidence earned through repetition, study, and survival. Landing accidents decreased dramatically. The phrase "one a day in Tampa Bay" faded into memory. Instructors who once questioned whether the aircraft could ever be tamed now praised its precision. They called it the only bomber that insisted on making its pilots better. But the true test was still ahead. Europe awaited, and no amount of training could fully prepare a crew for the chaos of flak bursts, cloud-covered targets, and enemy fighters diving from above. Yet something had changed. The B-26 was no longer a machine the pilots feared. It had become a machine they respected, trusted, and in some cases even loved. It had become a weapon ready for war. The men who would fly it into occupied France and the Low Countries felt something that the first trainees at MacDill never had. They felt that if they did their part, the aircraft would protect them. The Marauder had entered a new chapter. It had survived doubt, survived criticism, survived its own early mistakes. Now it was ready to prove itself over the fields, rivers, and fortified coastlines of Europe, where its true reputation would be written not in training reports, but in the lives it saved and the missions it brought home safely.
The first combat deployment of the B-26 Marauder in Europe did not begin with triumph or celebration. It began with a low gray ceiling over England, with wet runways, cold engines, and crews who were about to discover whether all the training and discipline they had fought to master would be enough to keep them alive. When the 322nd Bomb Group arrived in the spring of 1943, the air war over Europe was already a storm of steel. Every mission meant threading through flak corridors, dodging German fighters, and hoping the weather did not betray them. The Marauder crews felt the weight of this new reality the moment they saw the skies over the English Channel darken with clouds and distant smoke. The first missions were flown at low altitude, an approach intended to strike rail yards, power stations, and coastal defenses before German defenses could respond. But low altitude meant flying directly into the teeth of the enemy. Crews could see the faces of German gunners. They could hear the crack of 20mm rounds hitting metal, and they could feel the shock as flak bursts ripped open the air around them. On one of the earliest raids, a group of B-26s attempting to hit a power station near IJmuiden faced such intense flak that several aircraft were lost within minutes. The surviving crews returned shaken, scarred by the realization that the enemy had no intention of allowing them a learning curve. Newspapers back home seized on the losses. Skeptics of the B-26 resurfaced. But the men who flew the Marauder in combat learned something the world did not yet understand. When handled with discipline, the aircraft could endure punishment that would have destroyed lesser machines. It flew fast, so fast that German fighters struggled to make clean passes. Its narrow wings, once blamed for training crashes, gave it stability at attack speeds. And its strong structure absorbed hits that should have torn it apart. After the early losses, tactics changed. The Marauders shifted from low-level attacks to medium-altitude strikes, flying tight formations that merged their defensive guns into a single wall of fire. Formation leaders drilled their groups endlessly. They practiced turns by the second, altitude changes by the foot. The sky became their classroom and their shield. And when the enemy came, the Marauder was ready. Over northern France, crews learned to trust the aircraft's speed. German FW-190s dove in from above, only to overshoot when the Marauders held formation and pushed their throttles forward. Luftwaffe pilots complained that the bomber was too fast, too well defended, too hard to bring down without taking unacceptable risks. Missions became battles of nerves and discipline. Crews watched flak bloom around them in black puffs. Each burst rocked the aircraft. Each burst reminded them how thin the line was between survival and death. Yet time after time, the Marauder returned. Its pilots learned to ride the turbulence of flak and keep the formation intact. Its gunners learned to track fighters through narrow windows, trusting the concentration of fire from neighboring ships. And its engines, those powerful R-2800s, proved that speed was not just a luxury in war, but a lifeline. In late 1943, the Marauder began hitting V-1 launch sites, railway bridges, and coastal fortifications with increasing success. Accuracy improved, losses dropped. The aircraft that had once inspired fear now inspired something else entirely: respect. Crews began telling new stories. Stories of aircraft limping home with entire sections of tail missing. Stories of engines still firing after taking direct hits. Stories of Marauders landing with hydraulic failure, with blown tires, with wings shredded by flak, yet somehow staying intact long enough to protect their crews. By early 1944, the tone within the 9th Air Force had changed. No one spoke of Widowmaker anymore. Now they spoke of reliability. Now they spoke of precision. Now they spoke of a bomber that could take its crews into some of the most dangerous airspace in Europe and still bring them home. The Marauder had proven itself.
It had earned its place through fire and loss and perseverance. What began in the fear-soaked runways of Florida was now being rewritten in the skies of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The aircraft that had once terrified its own pilots was becoming one of the most trusted machines in the European theater. And soon the statistics would begin to show what the men flying it already knew. The B-26 was not just surviving the war, it was excelling in it. It was on its way to becoming the safest bomber in Europe.
By 1944, the B-26 Marauder had undergone a transformation so complete that even its harshest critics struggled to recognize the aircraft they once condemned. What had begun as a machine feared by its own pilots had become the most reliable and survivable medium bomber in the entire European theater. Every mission flown that year reinforced the same truth. The Marauder was no longer fighting the doubts of its past. It was fighting the German war machine, and it was winning. The turning point came in the months leading up to the Normandy invasion. The 9th Air Force demanded precision, speed, and consistency from its bomber groups. Bridges, troop concentrations, coastal fortifications, and railway lines all had to be struck with accuracy far beyond what older bombers could deliver. The Marauder excelled. Its pilots had mastered the aircraft's demanding flight profile. They kept speed high and turned smooth. They held formation with an almost mathematical precision. When the bomber streams approached their targets, the formations looked like silver blades cutting across the sky. The crews trusted the Marauder because they understood it in a way they never had before. They knew that at its higher cruising speeds, German fighters had difficulty lining up sustained attacks. The aircraft's slim profile and powerful engines gave it a unique ability to outrun danger. Luftwaffe pilots complained that the B-26 was a frustrating target. Dive too steeply and you overshoot. Approach from the rear and the tail guns find you first. Make a pass from the beam and the box formation blankets you with fire. German intelligence reports began listing the Marauder as a high-performance threat. They noted that bomber units flying B-26s returned from missions with fewer losses and maintained target accuracy even under dense flak. These reports were not exaggerations. They reflected a growing truth written in numbers. The B-26 had the lowest loss rate of any bomber flying in Europe. Not lower by a small margin, lower by an astonishing one. Just as important as speed was the aircraft's rugged structure. The narrow wings that once caused trouble during training now allowed the Marauder to cut through the air with remarkable stability. Its fuselage, strengthened by the design choices that once made it seem unforgiving, absorbed damage that would have destroyed other medium bombers. Crews told stories of B-26s returning home with entire panels missing, with fuel systems ruptured, or with control surfaces barely hanging on. The aircraft simply refused to die. During the Normandy campaign, Marauder groups were tasked with striking bridges over the Seine and Loire rivers. These bridges were vital for German reinforcements. Destroying them meant crippling the enemy's ability to respond to the Allied landings. The missions demanded absolute precision. The Marauder delivered. Pilots dove through layers of cloud, fought turbulence from coastal winds, and held their formation steady as flak burst around them in violent black flowers. They emerged battered but intact. The bridges fell, the crews returned. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the Marauder shifted its focus to rail hubs, supply depots, and troop concentrations. The aircraft's reputation among ground forces grew rapidly. Soldiers called them the reliable hammer of the 9th Air Force. They watched the bombers sweep overhead in tight formation, drop their loads with clinical speed, and disappear before German defenses could react. In late 1944, the Marauder played a crucial role in the Battle of the Bulge. The German counteroffensive threatened to fracture Allied lines and prolong the war. Despite brutal winter weather and limited visibility, B-26 crews flew mission after mission against German columns and supply routes. They attacked road junctions at Bastogne and Houffalize, struck bridges the enemy needed, and cratered rail lines feeding the offensive. The Marauder's ability to operate at high speed in dangerous conditions made it invaluable. Ground troops later reported hearing the aircraft roar overhead just before bombs shattered the frozen roads beneath German tanks. It was a sound they associated with survival. By now, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Across all groups flying the B-26, the loss rate had dropped to about 0.5% per mission. The aircraft that once inspired dread now inspired something far more powerful: trust. Pilots requested to stay on the Marauder instead of rotating to other aircraft. New crews arriving from training centers often asked specifically to join B-26 groups because they knew the reputation the aircraft had earned. The Marauder community formed a culture unlike any other in the Air Forces. They believed in discipline, they believed in precision, and above all, they believed that the machine would bring them home if they respected it. Veterans of those years later described flying the B-26 as being part of a silent pact. You take care of the aircraft takes care of you. As 1945 dawned, the Marauder continued to pound German infrastructure with relentless efficiency. The war was turning decisively against the Reich, and the B-26 helped accelerate that collapse. It struck oil depots, it shattered marshalling yards in the Rhineland, it targeted troop shelters as German formations retreated across the Siegfried Line. Each mission added to a growing legacy. The safest bomber in Europe was also one of its most effective. By the end of the conflict, Marauder groups had flown more than 100,000 sorties. They had dropped tens of thousands of tons of bombs with some of the highest accuracy rates of the war. They had shattered the early myth of the Widowmaker so completely that new crews found it hard to believe the aircraft had ever been feared. The B-26 had proven that the line between danger and mastery is often thin but always reachable. It had proven that the reputation of a machine is not fixed, but forged by the men who fly it, maintain it, and learn its secrets. And now, with victory approaching, the Marauder stood as a testament to everything that discipline, training, and courage could achieve. Soon the war would end. Soon crews would step out of their cockpits for the last time. But the legend of the aircraft they flew had already taken root. The Marauder had become more than a bomber. It had become a symbol of transformation, resilience, and survival.
When the last winter of the war settled over Europe in early 1945, the crews of the B-26 Marauders found themselves facing a strange mixture of exhaustion and momentum. The aircraft that had once been a source of dread was now the machine they trusted more than anything else in the sky. The men who flew it had become experts in its rhythm and temperament. They knew its climb rate, its turns, its strengths, and even the subtle sounds it made when strained by flak or stressed by evasive maneuvers. What they did not yet know was that they were writing the final chapters of the Marauder's journey, a story that would end not in fear, but in triumph. As Allied armies broke through the Siegfried Line and advanced deeper into Germany, the Marauder groups shifted into high-tempo operations. Their missions now struck at the collapsing infrastructure of the Reich. Rail yards at Koblenz, Mainz, and Saarbrücken, factories in the Ruhr, supply dumps hidden in forests, bridgeheads along the Rhine. Each operation carried the same tone: strike fast, strike accurately, return home. Crews who had once doubted the aircraft now trusted its every movement. They had seen the Marauder survive hits that ripped open engine nacelles or smashed through control surfaces. They had watched it fly back on one engine, sometimes weaving through clouds and flak with a stubborn determination that mirrored the spirit of the men inside it. More than once, a damaged B-26 landed with its tires blown, its hydraulics gone, or its fuselage peppered with holes, only for the crew to shake hands afterwards in quiet disbelief. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany were changing. Luftwaffe activity dwindled. German fighter units were short of fuel, planes, and experienced pilots. But the flak guns remained. They ringed every major city and industrial site, launched from fields, rooftops, and riverbanks. Their shells burst with vicious precision, and the Marauder crews still had to thread their way through these deadly corridors. Yet through all of this, the aircraft maintained its astonishing survival rate. Mission after mission recorded no losses.
Crews returned counting the jagged holes in their wings and fuselage, impressed that the machine had absorbed so much punishment and still brought them safely home. Veterans of these missions later said that the B-26 seemed to have a will of its own, a toughness that transcended steel and rivets. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, Marauder units gathered for group photos on the same airfields where they had once trained for missions they feared they might never survive. The aircraft stood behind them, scarred from months of combat. Some bore patched skin, others carried painted kill marks for flak guns destroyed or fighters driven off. Ground crews leaned against them with the pride of craftsmen who'd kept the machines alive. The final tally was staggering. More than 100,000 combat sorties, thousands of targets struck with accuracy that surpassed most medium bombers, and a loss rate so low that historians would later classify the B-26 as the safest American bomber of the European War. Only about 0.5% of sorties resulted in aircraft lost. This statistic alone turned the old reputation of Widowmaker into a relic of a misunderstood beginning. For the pilots, the transformation of the aircraft mirrored their own transformation. Many had arrived in Europe as untested rookies, burdened by the stories of Tampa Bay training accidents. They had feared the narrow wing and high landing speeds. They had wondered if they would survive their first mission. But the war had forged them into a brotherhood. They learned discipline, precision, and trust. They learned to respect a machine that demanded their full attention, yet responded with unmatched loyalty. As the world shifted from war to peace, the Marauder faced an uncertain future. It had performed brilliantly in Europe, but in the Pacific, the war was dominated by long-range operations where aircraft like the B-25 Mitchell and B-24 Liberator played greater roles. With no need for an expensive, high-performance medium bomber in the post-war years, the Marauder was gradually retired. By 1947, most of the aircraft had been scrapped or sold for parts. A few survived as test platforms or training machines. Only a small number would ever see preservation. But the legacy of the B-26 did not fade. Among aircrew, historians, and aviation engineers, the aircraft became a symbol of the learning curve that defines high-performance machines. It proved that a challenging aircraft was not a bad one. It proved that training and discipline could transform potential danger into unmatched survivability. It proved that a design ahead of its time might stumble at first, but if understood and mastered, could surpass every expectation. The men who flew the Marauder carried these lessons with them long after the war. In reunions held decades later, veterans spoke with pride about the aircraft that had once scared them. They described the long missions over France, the icy mornings over the Ruhr, the tense runs over German bridges, and the exhilaration of watching their squadron return with almost every ship accounted for. They remembered the feel of the cockpit at full power, the vibration of the R-2800 engines, and the way the aircraft held steady in formation even under fire. They also remembered the day they realized that the Widowmaker was not a curse, but a warning to those who underestimated it, a warning to those who tried to fly it without discipline, and a warning that even the most promising machines can fail if not paired with the right understanding. But once mastered, the Marauder became not just a bomber, but a shield. It protected its crews with a determination that defied its early reputation. It brought men home who believed they would never see another sunrise. It turned fear into trust and trust into legend. When the last B-26 was retired, the aircraft left behind a story that few bombers could match. It had begun its life misunderstood and doubted. It ended its service as one of the great survivors of World War II. A machine that demanded everything from its crews, but gave them something priceless in return. It gave them life. And so the legacy of the B-26 Marauder lived on, not in the roar of its engines or the gleam of its wings, but in the memories of the men who flew it, men who once laughed nervously at the idea of the Widowmaker, but who later understood that they had flown one of the safest and finest aircraft to ever take to the skies over Europe.